it was really the Nueces River. Technically, and they weren't trying to fool anybody, but it was the Nueces River that was fought. When they had Battle of San Jacinto, everything south of the Nueces was talked about then as being the Texas territory. Well, Mexico, this is an extremely important point, is that you must figure out, you think, well, did the United States, or did Texas, steal this land from Mexico? Now, it's a good thing my wife is there, because she'd be all over it. She's from a 400-year-old dynastic family from Mexico City. She's, you know, the royalty. She's technically a countess. So she always still thinks, you know, that Texas was part of Mexico. She still thinks that way. Okay, well, let me get this real good time capsule of what was going on at the time. The reason that Texas was taken over, and the reason that the rest of the whole land came with that package of, after the Mexican-American War that went all the way, Destinado Manifesto, all the way to the Pacific, was because Mexico, from the time of 1821 on up to 36, because of the Battle of the Alamo, 1836 and all that, Mexico was fighting among their own rulers. You know, when they got their independence from Spain, there was a bunch of them in there. One crew would come in and they'd fight, and another crew would come in, so they had presidents that went out, you know, right and left for that period of time. The United States and James Knox Polk, who by the way is a relative of mine, out of Tennessee, was sitting there shivering in their boots because they saw the European powers thinking about the New World. Well, from the Monroe Doctrine on, you can't think about the New World. You got, if you're going to be fighting like they were forever, well then you got to remain fighting over there. But so, at the time that Mexico was doing all this, and the consideration was launched in order to get Texas a part of the Union and all that went with it, they had a bigger plan. And that bigger plan is that sure, they won Battle of Palo Alto, they won all of these skirmishes involved in the Mexican-American War. And then they went to the hierarchy in Mexico City and they said, okay, look, these lands are really, by victory of war, they are rightfully ours. But we want to talk to you about the West. Sure as shooting, they thought that France, Germany, England, any of the European powers were going to take advantage of Mexico at that time, of the frailty of the government structure, and start colonizing the West. That's why all that land out there at one point, to keep another European power from coming in and getting it. Okay, so you understand that whole focus of why Brownsville was so important. Zachary Taylor was sent down here in order to lead that plan. And when he landed in Brownsville in 1846, and he began, and the war came about and all of that, that plan was put in motion. 1848, Stillman made a successful bid for a town site. There were several people that made town site bids, but Stillman was the one that got it. He got it for two reasons. Number one is that he had a very, very powerful New York and Northeastern banking community behind him. He had the money to carry it out. And secondly, his plan was for a town site in the shade of the quartermaster's fence. The quartermaster's fence in Fort Brown was right up next to the fort. Now, in those days, Brownsville and the environs was not a place you wanted to hang around. You know, the closer you got to the quartermaster's fence, in fact, if you got your wall and you're back to that, well, you'd be a lot safer off. So that's why Stillman's town site won. He started the town site, he laid it out, and I don't have the map here that shows the original town site, but there were about 300 squares. And this is a square that rambled around, kind of wrapping around the fort over here and fanned out into what would become Brownsville. Now, when they started clearing the land and selling it and whatever, you got to remember what time in United States history that was, 1848. We were on the dawn of the gold rush in California. We were on the western expansion. Everything that went into Polk's presidency really push this. There was a lot of press. And so there was so much emphasis on Brownsville that they just came in droves. The moment that he got a ratified town site, he had more business than he was supposed to stick in. They started from a population of nothing, zero. This was, Brownsville was Commons land from Matamoros, and it was grazing land. There was nothing here before then. It was, maybe 3 little shacks, and that was it, by herders.
Then why did the people rush to this place?
2 reasons. Well, a number of different reasons. Number one was, like I say, a lot of press from from the campaign of the Mexican War. We were victorious. We had a whole new Western expansion coming in. This ties in with what was going on in the immigration process in Europe and all of that, you see. Secondly, this was the short route, the safe route to California gold fields. That weighs very, very heavily in the whole plan, because they could either go across Utah, Nevada, and all the alkaline plains and deserts, and you know what went with that. Or they could come around by safe passage through ship to the port of Brazos Santiago, right here, and then take the land route going off across Mexico to California and go right on up.
Was that the same time when they started to give them some land to farm or something like that? Or the people
United States?
Try to get people down there?
The colonization here, specific, because don't get it confused with what was going on up in the territories, like Oklahoma, where you said you had 40 acres and a mule and all of that. No, this was a whole different kettle of fish. They didn't want to give the land away because, figure it this way, an acre, which in 1847 would have cost you about $2. In 1851, it was selling for $2,000. So who's going to give that away? Okay, so now there is a logic that went with why Stillman provided for what's called common spaces and public use, church sites, schools, parks, cemeteries, and all this went with the town site. That was given to the people, you see. And he was a very smart man. With the proviso, if it ever reverted back to public use, it would revert back to Stillman. Anyway, so they planned this, the city around this. Now, mathematically speaking, and we screeded the surface. Whenever you screed an old cemetery, you're going to see the burial shafts. It's different color earth. So you know the orientation and you know the measurements that went with it. So we calculated out how many spots or lots, blocks and lots were possible in this cemetery. This map didn't exist in modern times before I drew it. Yeah, but the thing is, it's a beautiful window into what the cemetery actually looked like. And it was gathered from a number of different sources. It was extremely hard to gather this information. And I have a bone to pick with Brownsville about that, because something so important, and nobody knew about it. How is that, does that show proper emphasis upon our heritage? Okay. If you number these out, you do all the math, and you compare it with your Sanborn maps to see what structures were there at given times, this is the way the cemetery looked. There's 700 and something plots. The maximum 700 people were buried here. Now, 1848, the town was founded. 1849, 1850, you had cholera epidemic, yellow fever. 2,000 people died at one whack. So they weren't buried there. But the city fathers, I'll show you, I'll tell you what, I don't have that map, but they were buried out on the golf course that's presently the golf course in Fort Brown, in mass graves. But anyway, for this land right here, the city fathers were saying, holy Moses, we got such an emphasis on South Texas. You've seen the Hollywood movies where they had lumber companies going up in the old western towns, and they got wagons going down the street, and there's a bustle of commerce. Well, that was what Brownsville looked like in 1849. So they went back to Stillman and they said, hey, we don't have enough room here, especially with what's going on in the medical community. 2,000 epidemic deaths, we're going to fill this thing up in no time at all. So they went back to Stillman and they said, can we have more land? And the town company says yes. So they picked, and they've got 2 squares of land that are further to the west and northwest. And that is the new city. You see, this was the old one, and they had plans in order to decommission this one. And also, this is near a much more valuable urban-centered land. And they say, well, how in the world are we going to, relinquish a valuable piece of property for a graveyard when we've got businesses coming up in proximity, and medical reasons too, because the deaths and the burials you don't want them around in your city center. The city was right over here. So the agreement was struck. Stillman says, okay, fine, y'all can do this one over here. And this one was the one they went for. Now, here comes the rub, and this again is a new finding. Nobody's ever put the 3 and 5 together to come up with what it is. This is the book that I wrote on the cemetery, the old one, this one. What I found through the research was that in 1849, 1850, City Council, it's a Board of Aldermen for Brownsville. They didn't have a council form of government until later. They were chattering about this need for a new cemetery, much more extensive lands. 1850, going on to 1851, it was ratified. The town side of Brownsville was given exclusive right for that other cemetery, so they began the process of decommissioning this. What happened in 1851, 1852? Well, number one, the California gold strike was going like this. Number two, you had a lot of work being done on the Transcontinental Railroad. See, there wasn't the emphasis for the safe route coming through Brownsville anymore. That hustle and bustle of the old wagon teams going down the main street and all this, and the lumber companies springing up and all that, that dwindled for a period there that scared the heck out of the city fathers. Now they've got 3 city squares of cemetery to deal with. Not to mention the cemetery that was in Matamoros, that was there since 1820s. The 2 cities were extremely strongly tied from the birth of Brownsville. Because whenever we had the Yankees coming in over here, well then everybody went over there, and whenever we had the Revolution going over, well, everybody came over here. So the cemetery was utilized by our merchants and all that over there too. And we had Fort Brown. We had the old post cemetery, the new post cemetery, and then we had the epidemic, the common graves over there and all of that went with it. And later on, we had a national cemetery. That was ratified by Lincoln in the National Cemetery Program was ratified in 1861. We were sanctioned to have the cemetery at Fort Brown on the island in 1867. So we had cemeteries all over the place. You got to maintain them. In the city coffers, you got to figure out how you're going to fence them, how you're going to patrol them, how you're going to do everything. So all of a sudden, this big one over here became a burden. People were always curious about, well, when did this one cease to be and the other one take up? Well, it was like 30 years. 30 years. There were burials that went on, and more than that actually. There were burials that went on in this cemetery that I found recorded in the archives going up into 1910. 1910. But the character of the burials was radically different once you start getting into the 1870s. The thing that launched the new city cemetery over here, the 2 squares, was the yellow fever epidemic of 1862. There were so many people that had succumbed to that plague that there were mandates, various mandates put in the newspaper and charted around town saying you must move your loved ones or whoever family members over to the new city cemetery in such and such a length of time, otherwise the city's going to do it for you. This was a strict mandate. In the Reconstruction period of 1867, there was a very, very strong mandate to do that, and then finally towards like I say, after that yellow fever epidemic, then they started, the people that were in society at that time then opted for the new grounds. And this one became secondary in favor. Now, mind you, in the new city cemetery going into the 1850s and all of that, the cost for a burial was $5. Now, You think you had $5 back in 58, 59, 60, 61? That was a lot of money. So the indigent and those that were not quite as prosperous, they continued to bury over here. And you can see it on the record. Also, something very, very different came about. You find the death records in stillborns, children, because a child mortality rate here, infant mortality rate, was extremely high back in those times. You found those in here, and the extremely elderly, and indigent, and such and such. So the whole character of the cemetery took a second stage.
Gene, this
Yes?
is the old downtown cemetery you're talking about,
Yeah, if
not
you
the
know-
one over by the expressway.
Right. This
the
is
old-
one that was
Yeah,
no longer
downtown.
on the books
Okay.
now.
Yeah.
This is the one that was off in front of the 1912 courthouse.
Yeah, okay.
You see, on the corner, the courthouse is right here, if you really want to picture it as a bird's looking at it. There's 12th Street, there's Monroe, there's Jackson, the Gladys Porter Zoo's over here, you know, over in that area, and then of course the rest of there. So that's this cemetery. And then another thing, because your city sextant is interchangeable. At times we had a city sextant, the other time the city marshal was involved in cemetery duties. On the overseeing of your burials and your budget that went with the cemetery and all that. They're obviously, you know, they have to sanction, and they'll have to kind of remain even in the background of a clandestine burial. Because some of these burials were not actually done in the broad of day. When we were digging over in here, we dug this, all right, this section right here, if anybody's familiar with 12th Street and Monroe, this section right there, about that much land, okay, there would be the alley, so yeah, about that much land, is the Lutheran Mission Church. This section right here is what we excavated. And all of a sudden, you know, we got our dimensions. And in the city alderman minutes later on, very deeply hidden, were further dimensions of what your carriageways were measured out as and all of that. But we started finding burials that were askew in the carriage paths. And it was, what in the world is this all? Well, it was obviously clandestine. You know, it's after this thing had been, you know, gone off into the secondary, tertiary use, you know, people would come in there in the dark of the night and put the burial there. They maintained staunch Catholic custom at that time, and that's how those occurred. Then we found something very much more strange. The anthropologist who was assigned to this had to yield to my theory of it. Back in 1909, we decommissioned the military reservation cemetery on Fort Brown, this national cemetery. And we moved all of those, exhumed everybody, and took them off to Pineville, Louisiana. And that was another national cemetery that was there. Okay, well here's a photograph that was done by Runyon, Robert Runyon, in 1909, and it shows some part of the exhumation process. And you can't see it from that distance, but just take the word for it. There's a fellow standing over what looks like almost like a Winchester arms box. You know, it's 33 inches long by 19 inches wide, and whatever. Well, those were the enlisted men. When they exhumed from the enlisted men, they packed them in boxes like that, and they loaded, how many? Something like 3,000 of those that were in that cemetery, and they carried them off to Louisiana. The officers were, of course, exhumed. They were put in full-length coffins. But anyway, I looked at that box, and I said, that's really. And then we started finding, in this cemetery, once we screened the surface, we found something that the anthropologist was sitting there saying, what is this? There were graves that were about 33 inches long, about 19 inches wide, something like that. So we started digging in the soil there, and there was indeed decayed wooden matter. So it was originally in a box, because it lists in the record that these boxes were creosoted and prepared for shipping. Well, we found the same dimension over here. And I presented this to the anthropologist, and I said, well, you know, isn't this possible that this was an exhumation, reburial? He says, that's what it is. But there's a reason for that. if you know how Brownsville is laid out, here's the cemetery, here's the courthouse here, here's Washington Park over here, you know of any of that? Okay, and then here's the city center over here. Back in the days prior to the building of the great dams and all that, all of the Delta area flooded. Why do you think that we had above ground tombs? Because if you dug in the water, and, you know, dug in the soil, it would, if there wasn't water there, it would be there next time there was a flood. So the reason that we found these boxes like that was that at times of convenience, and this again came out of the research, they couldn't bury in here because there was a swale between it and there was a boggy area over here. So they buried in the National Cemetery for convenience and then disinterred them and then buried them over here when the time was appropriate. Because the military reservation wasn't going to let these burials remain in that land that was military land. So that's why you had those kind of graves that appeared from time to time. And then also going up into the 1870s, 1880s, we even had notables for the old Brownsville crowd that still maintained records of it having been buried over here. Throughout the entire dig, the reason that this whole dig came about, the reason that if you all weren't, if you didn't see what appeared in the paper starting back in September or October I think it was, is that they're refurbishing the Dancy building. It's the 1912 courthouse, right? They were coming in here. Okay, there's the alley. There's what now is the alleyway between the streets. Okay, they were coming in here with an electric service, digging up a trench in order to do subterranean there and put a compressor pad for the full-on air conditioning that was required for the renovation of the Dancy building. Well, the work crews were out here, and all of a sudden the backhoe was going, and bones, there's bones all over the place. And they said, well, this wasn't a slaughterhouse. And they don't think, well, what the heck, why are all these bones? Then they found a cranium. So, oh, all right. So then, thank God. Now, this happens often. The law in Texas is whenever you find human remains, you must stop. There's no two ways about it. We are a sensitive society. And we're not just going, well, this is an old bone. I'll ask poor Urich, I know him well, and you throw him on in the alleyway. You got to find out and have a certain sensitivity as to what's going on with those bones. The law is you must notify the county sheriff and the Texas Historical Commission immediately. There's no question. The contractor was conscientious enough that he did that. His work crew came in and says, hey, what are we going to do with this? And so he called Austin, and they put a stop work order. Now, he was hesitant to do that because he knew that was going to be beaucoup bucks out of his pocket. A stop work order was going to cost the project probably $100,000. Yeah. But it was the right thing to do. So they stopped work on this. They brought in a contract archaeologist. They brought the head Texas Historical Commission in, and they assessed what was going to be needed for this. What could they do? Could they? Because it was a shallow route. I mean, it was actually not too encroaching a space route to come across here, go across the street, and go off into the building. But they still couldn't do it. Because nobody knew how many graves were there. Are there thousands or what? Well, we sifted through all of the mound, and the mound that had already been dug out of that trough was enough in order to fill this room almost twice. This room, this contained room. And so they had to go through that with sifters, sift through every ounce of it, and then see what kind of percentage of bones or cultural artifacts they might find. They didn't find very many. Let's go back to the time of the mandates to decommission the cemetery. What happened there is they put that notice in the paper that said, if any one of you have loved ones, just be sure and move them now. Well, think about it. In 1848, 49, 50, in the founding days of Brownsville, all of these were newcomers coming into the new empire. A lot of them were passing through, and they didn't have any relatives, a continuing family or whatever. And so that whole batch might have been a singular shot. They died, and that's it. Or in the life of this cemetery, if somebody did not have anyone that was going to care for them or whatever, the monument either fell down or there might not even have been a monument. And so when the city crews went through, I think we got them all. Well, those are the ones that we found. There was a handful of remaining pockets that we found. And so that's what we acted on. And then through the dredging of the tailings that we got out of that excavation path, there wasn't enough in order to really be saying that there were thousands of people that were there and we were going to invade a cemetery. It wasn't the case. So all of this was presented to county officials and the county commissioners, and then they made the decision. They said, well, one set of remains is a little bit too much for us politically. They're not going to stick out their neck and anything. It's going to be political. For all they knew, people would come, the flambeau and the pitchfork crowd would come in there and say, hey, look, y'all are insensitive to my great-great-grandfather Juanito's remains. And they, oh man, they were getting a political fury. So they said, well, just close it down. Now, the only structures, now these structures were summarily taken out from time to time, some portion of urban blight, but the county bought this tract right here up to there. There's other lots going on here, and converted it to parking. And we're talking about from, I've got the whole trail of land exchange from the 60s on. At the turn of the century, a huge lumber company and hide and bone yard and all that was here, there, and whatever. So they built over that existing cemetery at the turn of the century, going on into the 50s and the 60s and going on. There were homes all along here. This part had reverted to parking lot, but then once this was found to be what it was, because conveniently people in Brownsville for 50 years forgot that there was a cemetery. There was only a handful of people. And mind you, talking about children in the crowd, it was amazing. In the inner circle of the Brownsville Historical Commission, that group, one of them, and these are people, one of them was in, I'm not going to mention names, but they were in the Hunter room for 20 years. And when they were called to comment on this in the press, they said, oh, it was a old Ranchito cemetery. Ranchito, a ranch cemetery. And another one says it was an ancient Indian burial ground. Now, if you know the nomadic tendencies of the indigenous tribes of South Texas, they didn't do burial grounds. It's a European custom. There's no ancient Indian burial ground here. So anyway, they forgot about it for for those many years. Now the county commissioners are approaching Austin and say, well, what can we do with it? And Austin says, you can't do anything. Can we at least maintain a parking lot? And that portion is what's called previous use or prior use. They can do that. They can't alter it. Now, no mind that turn of the century they had buildings and structures that went up and down and were demolished and lived their lives and whatever. Previous use, well, that all went out the window. And so there's another plan of what they're going to do. Number one, they had nixed this entire egress of the electrical system to the Dancy building. What they're doing now is they're coming around over here. The county's got a piece of land, they're going to come in that way. And there are no cemeteries. So that's the life of the county project on that. What they're negotiating now with Texas Historical Commission is there is a soft impact, what's called public space type of treatment, whereas they can put paver blocks, but these paver blocks have holes in them and you can plant grass. So it's a firm surface, but you can have the ryegrass or whatever coming up through there. So they're thinking about doing that to accommodate the parking for the Dancy building, because that's a massive restoration. So that's most likely what will happen. These residences that are over here are not in county hands. They're like 1, 2, and then this line over here. So they'll remain as is. More than anything, it'll be green space for Brownsville, which is not bad.
What street is that on, those houses?
Jackson,
I'm sorry, I
Monroe,
didn't hear you?
Jackson, Monroe, 12th, and 11th. If you know the Pacheco Field building over here, it's a beautiful turn-of-the-century architecture that's still in the Pacheco family. That's right there. The Dancy Courthouse is right here.
Is the old jailhouse still?
Over here.
It's over there, it's way
Yeah,
far
that's
away.
over there.
Okay.
Twelfth is a one-way.
Yeah, to us when we coming into town, here, Elizabeth Street's down there. You know, Expressway would be back over into there. If you follow this street straight, it'll take you to the police station. That's Jackson. You know, goes over towards Gladys Porter Zoo and all that. But anyway, so that's what will happen. This will be converted, and what I wanted to do, I made this suggestion, and I think that they're going to do this, is that they will have a final act of sensitivity, and that they'll have the service, and a rabbi, a minister, and a priest, and then go through and reinter the remains, and then bless and sanctify the ground.